Okay, start over there. Thanks.
Thank you. Not quite sure. I was just wondering, Professor Mojalan, if the economic activity in those two areas could have played a role in the decisions. I mean, we're sensitive to the issue of ethnic bias in allocating funds, and surely the allocation of funds in the most efficient way is on the top agenda for all. I was just wondering if the economic activity in those areas were considered, if there would be another picture that would emerge.
Sorry, can you say your name and where you're from?
Yes, sorry, my name is Marissa Moore. I'm from the National Treasury in South Africa.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ibrahim McCoy, originally from South Sudan, but now is BSI. I thought the presentation were really interesting, and I have just a quick comment. I think we are not diagnosing what is the real problem in Africa. The first presenter seemed to forget that the amount of cake that is being divided is important. So I think the question should be, how do we create an environment that would allow the government to make proper decisions that are not decided by informal institutions? And I think that's where the problem is. I remember being in South Sudan where people who are not sent by the government to come to my office saying we need a pipeline in the home state of the president. And these informal institutions are so key in influencing either contracts, but it's not the priority of the government. So in my opinion, having an environment that is really, that create decision-making of the government in a proper way, that prioritize, that mobilize resources, I think when we have something like this, most of the government would actually move to the right direction. But I don't think it is ethnic favoritism that is the real issue. It's something that could be managed if you have an environment that prioritize, mobilize resources, and actually decide on what to be done. Thank you.
Let's take a question over here.
Alistair McKechnie, ODI. I've got two questions. The first one is about uncertainty. I mean, 20, 30-year planning horizons when we barely know the future 5 years ahead, and where there can be massive changes in technology. The second question, I think, is for Amit Mojaria, is on the politics of infrastructure. And I've been working a lot in fragile states where violence and chaos is always a risk. And I think even in Kenya they came very close to that, unfortunately pulled back. But is politically motivated infrastructure decisions better than allowing local power holders to simply extort rents? And there are these theories about markets for loyalty. On the other hand, there's also a literature on horizontal inequalities as a driver of conflict. So what's the advice for people advising governments on infrastructure decisions in what is a really complicated political environment, and where countries are going through a transition from a high risk of conflict to something hopefully more stable? Thank you.
Great. I think let's leave it at those three for now, and Ahmed, if you can start off, and then I'll hand it over to Ross and Shirley.
Great. Very interesting insights from everybody, so I appreciate the questions. I'll take the first one. The economic role in deciding where those roads are being placed is, of course, an important part to consider, and I sort of hinted, there are two exercises we do in the academic paper to try and address this. The first one I mentioned, where I said if the economic conditions that drive the placements, how would that road network look like? You know, a sort of a sensible measure of economic development is population. Where there's very little data, population serves as a decent proxy for where growth will take place. So according to population, infrastructure should not have been all going in the red and green areas. So that's one thing. The other is statistically, we sort of, you know, when the British left in the early 60s, there were a lot of really rich censuses done. So you have very good data on the agriculture potential of these environments, the connectivity, you know, the soil structure, etc. So, you know, across various measures, we're able to control the initial economic conditions in these places. So statistically, once you do that, even then, you find these biases turning up. So I will leave that discussion there. I'm happy to discuss outside the window to provide more of the statistical details if needed. Ibrahim, I must comment, I like your optimism. While, you know, I agree that there are many of these things seem to be first order issues, you know, how to understand prioritizing, who's in charge of what. But my understanding of, you know, again, I come very much from the academic side, but also having spent a lot of time in Africa, is a lot of this is being mentioned, but it's always sort of put under the carpet. Nobody ever takes the stance that even if there is any ethnic favoritism, what's the magnitude of these things? So a lot of it is sort of hush-hush, not discussed because of the information. You know, one of the panelists also mentioned that when they were writing these reports, getting access to information is extremely important. So I think while I take my hat off for, you know, your optimism, I think the reality on the ground is that there is favoritism, and this Kenya case shows that there is blatant favoritism. And, you know, that holds not only just in road infrastructure, but across public contracts on land. I have a paper on deforestation in Kenya, whereby I show that, you know, weak governance shows that weak governance introduces more deforestation when there's more political competition. So, you know, there are many examples. You know, very little quantitative evidence exists, but I think now the fact that, you know, we have GIS technology, we are able to go through archives and digitize information. I think we will be seeing much more evidence on these things taking place. So I'll stop there. And on the issue on violence and chaos, it's a complicated environment. I don't think I have an answer to that. But what increasingly is becoming important is the role of the private sector as well. So I will take a sidestep and look at South Sudan, for instance. The commercial sector in South Sudan now is pretty much run by a brewery. A brewery started there in the late 2008-9 when the country was formed. It has to import all its material. It has to generate its own power. So, and it's doing it. It's struggling, but it's surviving. You know, those examples are very important for us to understand that, you know, the role of the private sector is pivotal. And of course, you know, just like Jeffrey mentioned, that the state also has to play some form of a role. I think at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of a marriage between the two to see some sort of prioritization, better decision making, keeping in mind that at the end of the day, it's the private sector that's going to create jobs and not the state. So let me stop there.
Great. Ross?
I'll try to address the questions on the uncertainty, 20 to 30 years, and of course also the politics of infrastructure. And in some respects, I think it also is talking to that point about diagnosing what is the real problem in Africa. When you're looking at regional projects, committing, first of all, to 20 or 30-year horizon on an investment in a project where, you know, especially like a project like Inga, it's a national asset, but it has a regional impact. So who do you hold accountable? And if the government itself, as a private sector coming in to invest in these projects, who do you seek the guarantees from on this project? You know, you have to look to the government, but then you need the multilateral institutions to step up to the plate as well, and they can do that through the political risk guarantee facilities or with partial risk guarantees. And I think the World Bank and MIGA and all of them offer those kind of facilities. But the bottom line is still to get a project like that banked, you are asking the private sector as part of the funders, because those kind of projects cannot be funded only by government or by the MDBs or, donors. You've got to bring the private sector in as well, and they need to see that there is some kind of certainty on returns. And who do they look to on that? And so, you need to have those power purchasing, those offtake agreements in place. And then you're asking for the governments in the region to commit themselves, the utilities to commit themselves to an agreement to purchase that power at a future price that they're not sure will be there still in 20 years' time or even 12 years' time. And so those are difficult, those are complex projects to get financed. They're easier when you're dealing with national governments, because then you can hold the national governments accountable and you can actually deal with them. But even then, you have, as was pointed out, you have changes in government that happen every 5 years. And they reverse decisions. I mean, even there's been complaints about Norway reversing decisions with the pension funds on particular investments that were done a few years ago by pension fund investors, and then changing the rules. So it happens everywhere. All governments have these kind of approaches, and it's very difficult to then plan for the efficiency of a project. On the politics of infrastructure, I think a good example is Nigeria. The largest country in Africa, probably supposed to be the most, in terms of GDP, the biggest, overtaking South Africa. But it's sitting on 6,000 megawatts of power generation as a country of over 170 million people. South Africa is, 50 million people? We have 42,000 megawatts, and we're hopefully building more as well through the REAP program that South Africa has embraced. Also, we'll be seeing another 3,000 megawatts added to the base load. But Nigeria is 6,000 megawatts, of which probably only 3,000 is operational. And it doesn't suit the country to improve its generating capacity. Why? Because a lot of the ministers own diesel generators companies, and they want to sell those diesel generating companies and at whatever price they can make and extract rents. So they're constraining development in that country.
Great, thanks.
And on the issue of looking forward in terms of technology, look, in some sectors technology will change a lot, and therefore it's rather more difficult. So let's take broadband telecoms. You don't quite know what the next technology will be. For rural broadband, is it 4G? Is it fiber optic cable connection? And you have that uncertainty today. So and you don't know what the demand for this is going to be in 10 years' time. But I have to say that those are short-term assets as well. But most infrastructure that we consider as economic infrastructure is long-term assets for a start. Water and sewage works, road works, railways and power generation, for example. And actually most of that is related to the size and growth of the economy and also the population, particularly the population growth and where that's going to be. And actually we can probably make an estimate of what that's going to look like over 30 years today. When we could be out, of course. That's why the plan is to do this every 5 years, to recalibrate every 5 years what this looks like over 30. But I do think that for certain types of infrastructure, it is possible to look ahead, certainly in the UK, and see what it's going to look, what are those basic needs going to be like in 30 years. And those technologies, frankly, even if you have driverless cars, doesn't actually remove the need for the road. Trains will be with us for a long time. They're very popular in Britain, in the sense that they're overcrowded, and actually, more people use them every year. So you've got trends, you've got things that do enable us to have some confidence that we need to invest now, to meet 30 years' time. And of course, HS2 will take probably about 15 years to build anyway. So you've got an asset that will last for 100 years. So you really do have to try and make those sort of long-term judgments the best you can now, if you're going to have that scale of investment and that amount of that longevity of asset.
Great, let's open the floor again for questions. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, again, Zhi Liu from Peking University and Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And infrastructure has a characteristic of a long-term benefit and also economies of scales. Okay? And technically, I don't think we have any problem to determine what are the good projects to build. And the issue is really political. Now, what's in politics, I think there are two major factors. One is decentralization. Another is democracy. I'm sorry to say that. And in a highly decentralized country, we see local government are implementing a large number of small, inefficient projects, while the central government has not been able to come up with the finance to implement those big projects with national significance. Now, in the democratic country that I have worked, I have seen many times that the investment priority change, and often change to the opposite when the new government come on board. Okay, so this is the real question, real issue we are facing. And the question is how to make the infrastructure plan and the implementation apolitical. Now, before I listen to your response, I put something on the table. We need to sort out the benefit distribution of an infrastructure project across the space. This is the foundation to find a way to deal with this particular issue. And most of the infrastructure project would increase the land value. And now today, the Lincoln Institute is trying to promote the land value capture around the world. And I think that might be the key, where we should advise some sort of a central and local government partnership based on a public finance framework where the local government should also contribute to get the money. This will require us to really walk out from the older situation where the local government is expecting the central government to finance something for them, instead of they also make an effort to contribute to the process. Without this kind of framework, I don't think we can get away from this political influence of the project selection and implementation.
Hi, I'm Jeff Gutman from Brookings Institution. I have two quick questions, actually, though one might not be so quick. First, for Jeffrey, this issue of devolution. I mean, UK is kind of unique in this compared to a lot of the other OECD countries. What do you expect to be the impact of devolution on this decision-making? Actually, it relates to Tsilu's question as well, because we've been promoting more local. And you're moving that way, but it kind of goes against the grain in terms of this planning, independent institution, non-politicized. And the second question is for Rosalind is, you know, on this regional projects, is there anywhere in the world you can point to outside of the EU where regional projects have actually worked in the way you're talking? You know, has it worked in the Mekong region or in Latin America? I mean, what model do we have to actually follow?
My name is Bernard Anaba. I work for the Integrated Social Development Center in Ghana. Concerning the political constraint and other issue, I want to say that in terms of the democratic situation in Ghana, I may say that there is rather a positive bias in terms of ethnic project to ethnic groups. Usually you tend to have government wanting to win other constituents that they do not have a hold on. So you see that they do not go just by their strongholds. In any case, they do think that their strongholds belong to them, so they don't bother to send much project to those places. And other ethnic groups are also always ready to play the ethnic card. So governments are always careful not to, be so too biased, openly biased. The other issue is the fact that in terms of the competitive political situation in Ghana between two major political parties, you see that they tend to rely on public resources for their own political funding. And over the last few years, you realize that most projects tend to be too costly to, in terms of public resources. And this is a huge problem for Ghanaians. And it makes us think as to whether in the democratic era, is it the best way to go? Because you tend to lose a lot of resources because you have the political parties having a kind of political base that are made of people that we call the foot soldiers. They put a certain constraint on the executive. And these are faceless people at the grassroots level, and they tend to call the shots of what projects that they expect. And sometimes the executive has no too much, power to kind of sway some of those decisions. And it's making us lose so much in terms of projects. And I'll say that in terms of in the last 2 years, government had to pay almost $500 million out to litigants as what judgment debt. Because one government comes and the thing that the other government did not do, did not implement certain projects very well. They abrogate the contracts. It goes to court and they award penalty against the government and it is paid. And it is a kind of system that is going on. And you tend to think that the political class have kind of colluded to kind of fleece the people out of their resources in a way that they also have a certain strong constituents at the grassroots that support what they do. And this kind of system is making us fear this current state of infrastructure kind of movement in terms of how do we leverage this new initiative for infrastructure development. It seems to be a situation that's going to worsen in terms of what we have in Ghana. So it's a concern that we have in terms of the democratic system rather not playing to the benefit of the nation. And you always see that in terms of the political debate, they say that and they know it, but nobody seems to be able to, stem that kind of flow of issues in Ghana. Thank you.
Okay, let's respond and then take a last round of questions. Jeffrey, do you want to start off with the question on devolution?
Yeah, look, it's quite interesting. I spent quite a lot of time in China recently, and it's slightly taken me aback to realise that we're probably in the UK a far more centralised state in some respects than China, because you've got strong regions from what we can see. Whereas here, to date, about 80-90% of local government funding comes directly from central government. So in one sense, they do what they're told in this country, because the money is, the purse strings are sitting in Whitehall to actually control. So the state in the UK is actually quite centralised and quite powerful in terms of pushing through its agenda if it wants to build infrastructure. We want to change that, and this is what we're planning to do by actually devolving. Now, there's two levels of devolution. There's the national devolution, which is the Scots, the Northern Irish, the Welsh. The Cornish would like to fall into that category, but they're not going to be allowed to have their own national definition. And there, I suspect that we, in our traditional way, which is sort of incrementally, experimentally, bit at a time, bit here, a bit there, we're going to end up with a federal state. And in that context, what will happen is people like Scotland will decide, as they already sort of do, what infrastructure they need. And the state will then step back to be concerned with national infrastructure, which is, probably airports, connecting links and that sort of thing. And then with local government, where there's been a high degree of central control, we're allowing local taxes to stay with local politicians. We're doing a deal on that, though, which is you change your system of local government in exchange for that. And we're moving to a process of urban conurbations with one set of local administrators and a mayor that's elected directly. The deal is you get devolution, you give us a mayor. And you set up local institutions that are effective, and we'll give you devolved power. So, for example, in the north of England, we're saying to the northerners, you create transport for the north, which looks a bit like our agency in London for transport, and we'll give you devolution. So we're saying devolution goes with capacity building. So maybe there's parallels externally and internationally in this, but we'll only give them the devolved authority on spending their money when they get taxes, when they get the capacity to do that, and the political capacity to do that, as well as the technocratic capacity. So that's what we do. Now, this is a great experiment for this country, and we'll see how it goes. The National Infrastructure Commission, in part, is meant to be a balancing item on that devolution. So rather than Westminster saying to these devolved administrations, your infrastructure plan sucks, and actually you shouldn't be doing what you're saying you're doing, we are actually creating an institution that is a National Infrastructure Commission, which is independent of the politicians, to say the same thing, if that is the case. So we are putting also at the national level a check and balance on what is being devolved in our system. I agree with you about land capture. We've actually introduced new legislation to enable public sector bodies to capture the value of associated land development for infrastructure, to help fund land infrastructure, which is what happens in Hong Kong through the MRT there. And actually we will probably push that more and more. And I think that is a really important way of actually funding infrastructure, which is, if you build a road, you build a railway. Actually, a lot of people make a lot of money out of it around the edges by land developments. And actually, probably the public sector should capture that through extended compulsory purchase powers. So actually that feeds back into paying for the infrastructure. I think that's a really important thing for the future.
Your question to me on the any regional projects anywhere in the world that have worked is an interesting one and can be answered in several ways. Okay, there are a number of projects that are touted as regional projects in Africa, but also I think you could describe them also in Asia, but they're not really, and I'll give you examples. If we're looking at Asia, and I think we have somebody here, the Non Toon 2 project between Laos and Thailand is not a regional project, but it's a national project which has excess capacity and is able to export to another country. And in some respects, you find that minister this morning from Ethiopia talking about their power projects, wanting to export. They'll be touted as regional projects, but frankly, they're not. It's national projects with excess capacity, okay, that they want to now do a trading. And it can then become packaged as a regional project that way through, transmission lines crossing countries. And then you've got a regional kind of project. And Maputo Corridor in South Africa and Mozambique was also has been touted as a regional project, but it was really not. It was a bilateral agreement between two visionary heads of state, Mandela and Chissano, and they worked to bring it together, and that's why it worked. There are two other projects that I could refer to also. There's the Kenya-Uganda rail project, but those are not regional projects. Those are two separate projects, and the reason they're not regional is because each one coordinated their different regulatory framework. In Uganda, the projects end up in Uganda. The railway goes as far as the border of Uganda to Kenya, and then the rules change and the regulations change, and then the train, they continue onwards as a PPP going through to Kenya, but it's coordination. And what the problem with regional projects is that there's a lack of collaboration on harmonization of rules and regulations across borders, and it's very difficult for these countries to have done. And that's where the role actually of the RECs should be, to help to coordinate that, not to push the projects and try to actually package them for investment, because no one's going to buy them or get into them if they come from the RECs. So I think my view, what are successful regional projects are ones that are driven by the private sector, and nobody is seeing them happening, or they don't even recognize them as that. And I can give you, especially in the telecoms sector, there are so many projects that have brought together different carriers from different countries to develop, for example, sub-regional, submarine networks. There are two particular projects that are currently being developed right now called AAE1, Africa, Asia to Europe, and SIMIWI 5, Southeast Asia, Middle East to Western Europe. It's about 25 utilities or carriers involved in that. And they are collaborating through a common agreement called the Construction and Maintenance Agreement, to agree to build a network that links all of their countries and transfers data, telecoms, internet, whatever, from one region to the right through to Europe and back. Now, those are regional projects or continental projects, but they've been done by the private sector and they're not recognized as such as regional projects. And they avoid, and they collaborate and avoid whatever problems they have. But they have their special interests in there, and that's what makes it work.
Regarding the issue on the decentralization, democracy, and some of the things have already been covered. In the case of Kenya, for instance, it's very important how we define democracy. The setting we have here is where just multi-party elections are taking place. It takes a very long time for the strengthening of the other institutions to take place, acts to go through, etc. So that's one comment. So we shouldn't be just throwing the word democracy around. These are contexts which are imperfect democracies. On devolution, the new constitution in Kenya in the last few years, there has been much more powers being given to the lower administrative units. So, the data which I showed you stops in 2011, but post 2011, there's been several changes in Kenya. So it'll be very interesting to see if now that you have much more local level decision making, subject to the capacity, if we can see better decision making. So I think that's an empirical question, and one can do work on that. That's all I have to say in terms of my understanding in this setting. With regards to the Ghanaian case, well, some of the things you mentioned, we see in the Kenyan data. You mentioned that there's in the more democratic era, you have seen much more positive bias in terms of resource distribution. It's exactly true. Like in Kenya, once democracy arrived, there's much more equal distribution of road spending, both in terms of the actual road and the expenditure. And in a way, it's not surprising what you said. These agents are relying on public resources because that is the cheapest way to reward voters. I mean, it's not that the regime or the office of the president likes these co-ethnics. It's the cheapest way to reward them. You tax everybody, and you reward a few with public goods. That's the cheapest way to buy votes. So, in some sense, what you're mentioning is a typical characteristic, and it again boils down to strengthening the democratic system. In Kenya, once the constitution was changed to allow for multi-parties, it took another 6 years before the Media Act and the State Act on organizations of political parties changed. Hand in hand, there was a lot of NGO activity. NGOs could never fund political parties, but they started up think tanks, and I think in Ghana it's the same thing. There's been a lot of NGO funding of governance, institutions, and I think you need more of that. I don't think the journey is complete, and I think it's important to be aware that just having the ability for people to vote, that's not going to be enough. Information is important, but then you got to tweak the other acts and statutes to affect decision making.
Okay, thank you. Looking at the time, I think I'm going to defer the last round of questions to lunchtime. So let me summarize here in terms of what I've picked up. And I think we've been talking about countries with quite different contexts, quite different levels of development, quite different levels of infrastructure stock and histories and experience with managing investment in infrastructure. Nevertheless, I think there are some common threads, and the threads are that the importance of openness and transparency in planning for infrastructure. I think there's the importance of national long-term planning, especially even around regional projects. And I also think there's you can't de-link what to build from how to finance it. I think especially in the context of devolution, interesting points around who holds the purse strings and what happens when you hand over the responsibility to build. So thank you very much. Thanks very much to the panelists, and thanks very much to the audience. Lunch is for 1 hour, so please be back in the room at 2:00. Thanks.